There is something you do every single morning, before you even reach for your phone, before coffee, before a single conscious thought forms. You put on a face, not a literal mask, something quieter, something so automatic it doesn't even register as a choice. You adjust, you prepare, you pre-calculate how you are going to show up depending on who you are going to see. Your boss, your partner, your parents, your friends. And somewhere in that split-second performance, the real you, the version that existed before you learned what was acceptable, gets quietly tucked away. And here's the part that should disturb you. You have been doing this for so long, you no longer remember what you looked like before the performance began. This video is a deep psychological excavation of why so many people spend their entire lives imprisoned in an identity that was never actually theirs. And what begins to happen? Slowly, then all at once, when they finally stop performing and start looking inward. We are going to walk through the exact mechanism Carl Jung identified over 100 years ago. A mechanism that is still silently running your life right now. Controlling your choices, shaping your relationships, dictating what you allow yourself to want. By the end of this, you will understand why you feel that quiet, nagging sense of unreality. That subtle feeling that you are watching your own life from a slight distance. Like a passenger in a car you are supposed to be driving. This is not a self-help pep talk. This is a confrontation. And it starts with the most unsettling question I can ask you. What if the person you have been calling you, your opinions, your values, your personality, the things you say you want from life, what if almost none of that is actually yours? Think back, not to a specific memory, to a feeling. The feeling of being too much, too loud, too sensitive, too angry, too needy, too curious, too weird. You didn't need anyone to say those words directly. Children don't need direct language. They read the room with terrifying accuracy. A parent's sigh at the wrong moment, a teacher's irritated glance, the way a room goes quiet after you say something honest. And in that silence, a lesson gets written. Not in words, in the body, in the nervous system. This part of me is dangerous. This part of me makes me unlovable. This part of me needs to go. Carl Jung gave this a name. He called it the shadow. But before we get there, we need to understand what gets built in its place. Because here is the deal. When a child decides consciously or not, that certain parts of themselves are unacceptable, they don't collapse. They are too resilient for that. Instead, they do something extraordinarily clever. They built a substitute. They construct a version of themselves that the world will approve of. A curated, edited, smoothed-out identity. A face designed to earn love, avoid punishment, and guarantee belonging. Jung called this the persona. From the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. And here is what makes this so insidious. The persona works, at first brilliantly. You smile at the right moments and people call you warm. You suppress your opinions and people call you easygoing. You perform competence even when you feel like you are drowning, and people call you strong. The mask gets rewarded constantly. Every compliment, every acceptance, every moment of belonging, it is all conditioning, reinforcing the mask, making it feel more and more like your actual face, until one day, it is. You are at dinner with people you have known for a decade, and you say something you do not actually believe. And no one notices, because they have never met the version of you that would disagree. They fell in love with the persona, and you have been so deep inside it you forgot the difference. You get the job, the relationship, the apartment, the life that looks right from the outside. And still, in the quiet moments between tasks, in the half-second before sleep, something whispers. This isn't it. Here is how the cost is collected slowly. So slowly you never see it as a single theft. You are in a meeting and someone suggests an idea you think is wrong. You feel the disagreement rise in your chest. Sharp, clear, real. And then you watch yourself nod. Not because you changed your mind, because the math happened in a fraction of a second. Speaking costs more than silence. That is not diplomacy. That is erosion. You are with a friend who consistently talks over you, who takes up all the oxygen in the room, and every time it happens, you feel a flash of something. Frustration, maybe anger, and you swallow it. You redirect it into a joke about yourself, and later you will feel vaguely tired and not know why. That fatigue, that is the weight of unexpressed truth. You are on a date, and you perform the most agreeable version of yourself. You like the things they like. You downplay the parts of you that feel too complicated to explain. And it works. They are charmed. But somewhere underneath the charm, you are watching yourself think, if they knew who I actually was, would this be happening? That question, that quiet, chronic self-doubt, that is the persona collecting its toll. Because here is the brutal reality of building your identity around what the world will accept. You become completely dependent on external approval to feel real. When someone compliments you, you feel solid. When someone criticizes you, even gently, the whole structure trembles. Because the self that is built entirely from external feedback has no internal foundation. It is a tower with no ground floor, beautiful from the outside, hollow at the core, and the more you chase the approval, the promotion, the likes, the validation from the people you love, the worse the hollowness gets. Because you are feeding the mask, not the soul. Jung described it with devastating clarity. He said the persona is the very first thing that must be dismantled on the journey to wholeness. Not because it is evil, but because confusing the mask for the self is perhaps the most common and most quietly devastating mistake a human being can make. But here is where it gets complicated, because the persona is not the only thing you built. When all those parts of you got repressed, the anger, the wildness, the desire, the grief, the parts that were told to sit down and be quiet, they did not evaporate. They went somewhere. And what happens next, what lives in the part of your psyche you have never been willing to look at, is the piece most people spend their entire lives running from. Jung called it the shadow, and the name is perfect, because a shadow doesn't vanish when you stop looking at it. It moves when you move. It grows larger when the light hits it from a certain angle, and on a dark enough day it becomes indistinguishable from everything around it. Your shadow is made of everything you decided was too dangerous to be, the rage you swallowed every time you were humiliated and called patient, the ambition you buried because wanting too much felt greedy, the sadness you armored over because vulnerability felt like an open wound in a world full of knives, the creativity you strangled because being seen felt more dangerous than being invisible. And here is the part that will make you uncomfortable. Your shadow does not sit quietly. It shows up in the person who irritates you for no real reason. Pay attention to that irritation. Because often, not always, but often, the thing that enrages you most in another person is the precise thing you have most aggressively locked away in yourself. The person who despises arrogance in others and has never once permitted themselves to take up space. The person who is furious at other people's recklessness and hasn't taken a genuine risk in 15 years. Jung called this projection. The unconscious has a very specific way of showing you what you've buried. It points at other people and screams. And it doesn't stop there. It shows up in the 3 a.m. spiral, the inexplicable sadness on what should have been a good day. The self-sabotage right at the moment success is within reach. The argument goes 30% further than the situation deserved. That is not you malfunctioning. That is your shadow demanding to be acknowledged. But here is the thing almost no one tells you about the shadow. The darkness is not all that is down there. Mixed into the repressed anger and the buried grief and the swallowed truth, there is also your unlived potential, your authentic desire, your real aesthetic, your actual voice, the part of you that knows exactly what it wants. That has always been known. That has been waiting in the dark for you to stop pretending you don't hear it. And when you finally go looking, when you finally decide to face what has been waiting in that shadow, something begins to shift. Something that will change every relationship you have, including the one you have with yourself. But here is the question you have to sit with before we get there. What if you choose not to look? What if you keep the persona polished and the shadow buried and continue exactly as you are? Because Jung had a very clear answer for that. And it is the most important part of this entire conversation. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that does not come from working too hard. It comes from performing too consistently, from maintaining a version of yourself that requires constant vigilant effort to sustain, from waking up every day and sliding back into a role that fits just well enough that no one questions it, including you. Jung watched this pattern in his patients for decades. He called it the refusal of individuation. And he was unflinching about what it produces. It does not produce peace. It produces a life that looks acceptable from the outside and feels like slow suffocation from the inside. It shows up as chronic restlessness. You change jobs, partners, cities, and the feeling follows you. Because the feeling was never about the external circumstances. It was always about the interior. It shows up as the inexplicable anxiety on Sunday evenings. Not because Monday is hard, but because somewhere in the pause between the weekend's distractions and the week's demands, the real you surfaces for just a moment, and then has nowhere to go. It shows up as resentment that has no clean address. You are not angry at any specific person. You are angry at a life that was built entirely around other people's definitions of what your life should look like. And the deepest cost of all? The people who love the persona don't actually know you. They love a version of you. A carefully managed, edited, pre-approved version. And somewhere underneath all the connection, underneath all the belonging the mask was designed to guarantee, there is a specific, terrible loneliness. The loneliness of being known without being seen, of being chosen for a costume. Most people hit this realization somewhere in their late 30s or 40s. Jung called it the midlife crisis, but he meant it as a psychological event, not a cliché. It is the moment when the first half of life's project, building the persona, earning acceptance, accumulating the external markers of success, collapses under its own weight. And the question that was always underneath everything rises to the surface louder than ever. Who am I when no one is watching? Some people answer that question with courage. They begin the real work. Others double down on the performance. They buy faster cars, chase younger attention, pivot to harder ambition, anything to outrun the question. But the question is patient. And this brings us to the only real answer Jung ever offered. Not as a life hack, not as a weekend exercise, but as the central project of a human life. Jung called the process individuation, and what he meant by that word is nothing like what the self-help world has turned it into. He was not talking about becoming your best self. He was not talking about optimizing your morning routine or journaling your gratitude or deciding to love yourself more. He was talking about something far more demanding and far more profound. He was talking about becoming whole, not better. Whole, which means integrating the parts you love and the parts you have been running from. It means looking at the shadow without flinching, not to become what is buried there, but to reclaim the energy that has been locked inside the repression. Because repression is expensive. It takes extraordinary psychological energy to keep parts of yourself in a cage. Energy that could have gone toward your actual life, your actual creativity, your actual love, your actual ambition. The first step in individuation is the most uncomfortable one. You stop defending the persona, not publicly, not dramatically, not in a way that requires a speech or an announcement or burning your life down. Internally, quietly. You begin to notice the moments when you perform rather than simply are. You start to catch yourself adjusting before the words leave your mouth. You begin to feel the micro weight of each small self-betrayal. The yes when you meant no. The laugh when you felt nothing. The agreement when you had a different truth. You don't have to fix it immediately. You just have to notice it. Because what you cannot see has total power over you. The moment you see it, the game changes. The second step is the one most people refuse entirely. You turn toward the shadow. Not with a weapon, with curiosity. You start asking a different set of questions, not what is wrong with me, but what have I not allowed myself to be? The anger you buried, what does it actually know? Because anger, real anger, is almost always pointing at a boundary that was crossed, a value that was violated, a self that was erased. It is not the enemy. It is information. The ambition you hid because it felt dangerous to want too much. What does it see in you? What does it know you are capable of that the persona has been carefully keeping modest? The grief you armored over, what is it actually mourning? Because unprocessed grief doesn't disappear. It becomes numb. And numbness is the enemy of a fully lived life. This is not comfortable work. None of it is, and Jung never promised it would be. He said individuation requires tremendous courage, not the cinematic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that means sitting with yourself in the dark and refusing to reach for a distraction. But here is what he also said, and this is the part that changes everything. On the other side of the shadow, when you have looked at what you most feared to see, you find the self. Not the self the world built, not the persona, not the curated identity. The original self, the one that existed before the world got its hands on you. And this is where the real transformation begins, not just internally, in the actual texture of your daily life, in your relationships, in the work you choose, in the way you move through rooms. When the persona loosens its grip, something strange happens to the people around you. Some of them get uncomfortable. And that discomfort is important data. Because the people who only ever connected with the performance, who needed you agreeable, available, unthreatening, predictable, will feel the change before you can explain it. The relationship recalibrates. Some of them will rise to meet the real you. Some of them will quietly withdraw, and for the first time you will be able to tell the difference. The relationships that remain, the ones that can hold the weight of your actual self, become something qualitatively different. Because now there are two real people in the room, not a person and a projection. Your work shifts. Because the energy you were burning on performance gets freed up for actual creation, for real opinion, for the kind of contribution that only you, the specific, unedited, unrepeatable you, can make. Not the version calibrated for universal approval. You start making different decisions, not louder ones necessarily, but realer ones. You say no to the things that were only ever obligations to the persona. You say yes to the things your actual self finds genuinely meaningful, even when they make no strategic sense. Even when no one will congratulate you for them, the anxiety doesn't disappear. But it changes character. Instead of the diffuse, sourceless dread of a person who doesn't know who they are, it becomes specific, situational, manageable. Because now you have an interior reference point, a ground floor. You become, in the truest sense, harder to manipulate. Because manipulation requires a target that needs something from you badly enough to compromise itself. When you no longer need universal approval to feel real, the leverage dissolves. And perhaps the most surprising thing of all, the loneliness eases, not because your social life expands, but because you stop being a stranger to yourself. And there is a specific quality of loneliness that lives only in the gap between the persona and the self. In that interior distance between who you perform and who you actually are. When that gap narrows, the loneliness that lives inside it has nowhere to stand. Jung described this as the beginning of the second half of life, not in terms of age, in terms of orientation. The first half of life is about building a structure, an identity, a place in the world, a version of yourself that can survive the social environment. The second half is about discovering what that structure was built to protect, and whether it is time, finally, to let the thing inside it breathe. But the individuation process doesn't stop at the persona and the shadow. Jung identified something even more foundational at work underneath all of it. He called them archetypes, and they are not metaphors, they are structural features of the human psyche. Patterns of energy that every human being carries, regardless of culture, era, or language. The hero who drives you to face what is difficult, to push through, to prove yourself. The sage who hungers for understanding, who is never satisfied with the surface explanation. The rebel who feels the wrongness of systems before it can be articulated, who was born slightly sideways to the consensus. The caregiver who feels genuine pain at the pain of others, who is most alive when in service. These are not personality types, they are forces. And here is the problem. Most people over-identify with one archetype and starve the others. If the hero is all you are, you have no permission to be fragile. You push through injury, physical, emotional, psychological. Because stopping would mean admitting something the hero cannot afford to admit. And eventually, the body delivers the message the psyche refuses to receive. If the caregiver is your entire identity, you have made everyone else's needs more legitimate than your own. You give and give and give, not from abundance, but from fear. Fear that if you stop giving, you will stop being loved. And you burn through yourself in the service of an equation that was never fair to you. The work of individuation, the real deep work, is learning which archetypes dominate your life without your knowledge, and finding the ones you have been denying. How do you find them? Look at what makes you irrationally angry. Look at the stories that move you without explanation. Look at the characters in films or books you love with a loyalty that feels almost personal. Look at the recurring dreams. Look at the patterns in your choices that you cannot seem to break no matter how much you want to. The archetypes are already speaking. The only question is whether you are listening. And now, after everything we have walked through, I want to ask you something. Think about the person who irritates you most right now. The one who gets under your skin for a reason you can't quite defend. Think about the role you play most consistently. Not the one you chose, but the one that was built around you. Think about the last time you said yes and meant no, and the precise calculation that happened in that fraction of a second. That is your map, right there. In the things that bother you, in the role you have outgrown, in the compromises you make so automatically, you no longer notice them. That is where the real you is trying to be found. Finding your true self is not a revelation. It is not a single moment where the clouds part and you suddenly know exactly who you are and what you want and how to live. It is a practice, a direction, a consistent choice to turn toward the interior rather than away from it. Jung spent his entire career watching people wake up to themselves, and what he found, across thousands of patients across decades, was not that self-knowledge makes life easier. It makes it more real, more textured, more genuinely lived. Because here is the truth. A life built on the persona can be successful. It can be comfortable. It can look from the outside like everything a life should be. But it cannot be yours. And somewhere in you, in the specific, unrepeatable architecture of your psyche, something knows the difference. That is why the whisper never stops. That is why the feeling of distance never fully resolves, no matter how much you achieve. That is why the most successful version of the performed self can still sit in silence on a Sunday evening and feel, beneath all of it, quietly lost. The real you is not something you become. It is something you uncover, layer by layer, year by year, with enough honesty to notice the mask, enough courage to look at the shadow, enough patience to sit with what you find there without immediately trying to fix it or defend it or explain it away. This is the journey Jung called individuation, and it is arguably the most important journey a human being can take. Not because it produces a better life, though it often does, but because it produces an authentic one, a life that, at the end of it, you can say was actually yours. So here is what I want to leave you with. Not an assignment, not a framework, just a question. The one question Jung believed every person must eventually face if they want to stop being a passenger in their own existence. What parts of yourself have you been hiding, not from the world, but from you? Sit with that. Let it be uncomfortable, because the discomfort is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that you are getting close to something real. Leave me a comment. I want to know, what part of this hit differently? Was it the persona, the shadow, the moment you recognized yourself in a pattern you didn't choose? Let's actually talk about it, not the polished version of what you think, the real answer. And if you want to go deeper, if you want to understand the specific psychological mechanisms that keep people trapped in their unconscious patterns, the next video picks up exactly where this one ends. And the concept it breaks down is the one most people have the most violent resistance to, which usually means it is the most necessary. Keep watching, because this is not the end of the conversation. It is the beginning of a different kind of life.